Welcome to the Wide Lens podcast, where expanding your perspective on recent history is our mission. Listen to untold accounts from overlooked voices and see familiar stories in a whole new light. Ready to dive deeper? Let's begin.
Hey folks, on this episode of the Wide Lens podcast, we're honored to have Steve Reynolds join us. Steve is recently retired from global aid work, living with his family in South Carolina. But what we're going to do is we're going to rewind time a little bit and start at the very beginning of his career. In the mid-1980s, Ethiopia was ravaged by a devastating famine that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and drew global attention. Amid the crisis, U2's frontman Bono and his wife, Ali Hewson, quietly traveled to a World Vision relief camp in Addis, seeking to serve rather than to be seen. Now, Steve, whom was one of the first to document the famine, and as a seasoned humanitarian storyteller, helped welcome the couple and get them set up at a camp in northern Ethiopia where they immersed themselves in aid work. They created music and drama programs for children that were traumatized by hunger and displacement. After their time at the camp, Steve spent a few days escorting Bono through some of the relief efforts. He described Bono's shift from discomfort to profound compassion, a moment that helped launch his lifelong journey into advocacy and global humanitarian work. Welcome to the Wide Lens podcast, Steve. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show with us.
Hey, Brad. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Okay, Steve, we're going to jump right into this. But before we go over into Ethiopia in the mid-'80s, first question that I've got for you is, what was really the catalyst, or what experiences did you have that really prepared you to document a crisis at this scale? I mean, this is a global crisis. The whole world eventually knew about it. It's 40 years on right now this year. What prepared you to be able to handle something like this? You were a guy, what, in your 20s at that point?
Yeah. I was in my early 20s. And I have to start by saying that nothing can really prepare you for what I saw and experienced in Ethiopia. It was just, as you said it was an unprecedented human crisis. But a couple of things kind of happened or were part of my life growing up that I think in hindsight, now that I look back, really were instrumental in kind of preparing me to take on something like this. And one of them was the fact that my dad actually worked for the US government. He worked for the CIA back in the 50s during the Cold War. And he traveled a lot, and he would come home from his trips and he would bring interesting things from around the world. One time he brought back a set of spears from Africa, and one time he brought back these cool camel saddles from Egypt. And so our house was like dotted.
Do you still have that stuff?
No, I don't know where that stuff's gone. That was, 50 years ago.
Right.
But I don't have any of that stuff. But he brought back these cool things. And I remember, even as a young child, being aware of this kind of great big world out there that looked nothing like what my world looked like. So I had that sort of sense of the world. And then as I got older, I sort of became aware of, how things were in the world. And this was during the racial issues that were going on in the 60s and 70s. And the world there was the various things going on around the world that I could tell were just not right. And I remember watching a movie. I don't know if you remember this movie or not, but I remember watching a movie called The Year of Living Dangerously with Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver, and Linda Hunt played the most amazing part in that movie. She played a male journalist in Jakarta, and she was she in her off time when she wasn't, filming for news, she would go to this slum area in Jakarta, and she would take care of this family, this little child that she knew down there, and she would bring food and things like that. And someone asked her, the character, him, actually it was a him, she played a man. And why do you do this? What motivates you to go down there and do this? And she said, I just add my light to the sum of light. And I remember that distinctly, watching that and thinking, wow, that's really, really cool. You can't solve every problem in the world, but what you can do is you can add your light, however bright it is, to the sum of light and somehow make a difference in the world. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing. And that really motivated me a lot when I was considering the job with World Vision. I remember thinking about that scene in that movie and thinking how cool it would be to, actually do something about that, actually act on that sentiment.
It's really empowering because if we look at some of the stats around the world of how a lot of folks have to live, there's over 2 billion folks that don't have access to safe, clean water. I think it might even be larger than that. There's a lot of folks living with food insecurity. There's a lot of people living in conflict areas. And you're right, Steve. It's just so easy to get overwhelmed and say, what can a little life like mine do with such a big problem? And we can feel stifled or we can feel disempowered because of that. But at the same time, if we go, I've just got one life, and if I could use my life to be a benefit and improve just one more life, that's a worthy life. And I know that you've had a chance to impact thousands of people, if not millions, over the years. And I really do believe that if it's just one person, it's worth it, isn't it?
Oh, exactly. And the key is you don't know all the answers in the beginning. You just go out and you just take one step and you do one thing, and then that leads to another, and that leads to another. And if you're faithful and you work hard, you find yourself in a situation like I did, which was incredible. I consider myself to be incredibly fortunate to have done the things I've done and lived the life I've lived and seen the things I've seen. And it was just really just saying yes one time and then saying yes another time and then just keep going like that.
What did your CIA father think of the decisions that you were making with your occupation and the situations that you found yourself in?
Well, he was retired by the time I joined World Vision, and he and my mom both were just incredibly supportive of me. They just said, son, whatever God is leading you to do. And that's the kind of parents they were. They were not hard taskmasters. Maybe they should have been a little bit more when I was in school, but they just kind of let us do the things that that we found a passion for, and they found ways to support all. There were four of us kids. I was one of four, the youngest of four, and they just found ways to support us in whatever path we chose. And it was great. I'll never forget that. And I'll always be grateful to my parents for the way they just let me follow my own path, march to my own drummer, do my own thing, you know, and it was great. And I will always be grateful for that.
It really says a lot to, the character of your parents that they had a lot of confidence that they were just going to raise you guys and point you in the right direction and then let you unleash the passions that you had. I've got a good friend and he's a pastor, and I met his dad, Bob, and his dad was like a 4 or 5 star general. And when I met
Mm.
him, I said, like, I think you're amazing because You were a 4 or 5 star dude. I don't remember what it was, really high up. And you gave your son space to become a pastor. And he said, hey, it's his life. And I'm really proud of what he's doing. But that really says a lot because, someone who gets to that level in the
Yeah.
military is going to be really driven. But he was really gracious with his son. And I was really impressed with that. But for him, it was like second nature. He's like, of course.
That's cool.
Steve, getting over to Ethiopia, tell us a little bit about that. Like, how did you first hear about that there was a famine going on? And what made you say, like, okay, I'm going to go right into the line of fire and I'm going to head on over there? How did that happen?
It's interesting, Brad, but I really kind of just backed into it because I did not know, and the world did not know in sort of spring of 1983 that there was this huge famine developing and going on in Ethiopia because the Ethiopian government at the time had done everything it could to keep it secret, to keep it from the world. In fact, they had banished journalists and banned journalists. They were not allowed to come in, if they did come in, the only thing that journalists were allowed to do was to film, these big government, parades and stuff like that. It was a Marxist government at the time, and then they couldn't go anywhere in the countryside. And so what happened was that we at World Vision began to get reports from our Ethiopia office saying that things were getting really bad in some of these villages and some of these communities where we had been working for years. We had child sponsorship programs all over the country. And they began to kind of, sound the alarm that things were getting really bad, that there was no food, there was hunger, and people were showing up at the World Vision offices looking for food, which was something that really had not happened before. So that was when World Vision decided to send a survey team into Ethiopia. And this was like summer, sort of June of 1984, where they sent a team in to say, okay, let's take a look. Let's send somebody in. Let's do some looking around. Let's talk to people and see what's going on. And as divine providence would have it, I was actually asked to go on that survey trip because the normal sort of photographer guy who would normally have gone on something like this was busy on another assignment. So I just kind of got picked out of a lineup and said, "Pack your bag. You're going to Ethiopia."
Steve, did they prepare you? I mean, did you know some of the sights and sounds and smells that you were going to see once you got there? Did you know what you were getting into?
No, I had no clue. I
Basically, they're
was,
telling you there's a food insecurity happening in Ethiopia. We need to document it. We need to bring it back to folks so they can support, engage in it. They told you that much?
Yeah, well, yeah, it was a survey trip, and they would do this. I didn't know this, but this was a common practice at World Vision. They would send a team of experts and either a doctor or, in this case, just our relief director, whose name was Russ Kerr, to go and have a look and make recommendations on any kind of relief program that might be needed. So that was just what was going on. And in fact, when I found out that I was going on this survey trip, they were already there. They were already in Ethiopia and had already toured the northern part of the country. And they were sending back reports that were shocking and alarming. And they said, well, we got to get a photographer in there. We got to get somebody in there to record it on video and on film. And so that's when they came to me and said, though they asked me, do you want to go? And of course I said, well, yes, I'd love to go. Who wouldn't want to go on a trip like that? So, and I'd never been really, I had been on one trip with World Vision, but this just sounded like, oh, the greatest opportunity in the world for me, for a young man at that time. So I said, absolutely. And yeah, off I went.
Had you been to East Africa before?
No, I had made one trip prior to this to Egypt, to Cairo. and we had done some filming along the Nile in some projects in Cairo. But that was it.
Great. So the World Vision Aid Camp, it was located in Ajibar. Is that how I say it? Am I close to it? How do we
Yeah,
say that name?
Adibar. Mm-hmm.
Ajibar. So it was in Ajibar. Why did World Vision decide that that was where they were going to set up a relief operation? Why did they decide to do it there?
Yeah. So at that time, this was later now, time went by and I got back from my survey trip with Russ and the team, and they put together a relief program for the famine in Ethiopia. They really kind of pulled out all the stops. And of course, what happened later that year, you may recall, and your audience may recall, that the footage that the BBC got in Ethiopia, the BBC went in later that year in 1984. They went in with a film crew and filmed in those camps. And World Vision, interestingly enough, actually facilitated that film trip for the BBC. They used our airplane, which I might mention was one of our first ever USAID grants to World Vision, was to pay for this twin engine aircraft that we used in Ethiopia to shuttle food into our various relief camps. So they had actually used that aircraft to bring the BBC into upcountry for the first time, first crew that had done that. And that broke the story. I mean, that broke in the news media like a hammer. And everybody suddenly was aware of the famine in Ethiopia. And everybody was clamoring to get into Ethiopia, these agencies like World Vision, but many, many of them. And so what World Vision did was we went in with a big relief team to Addis Ababa, and we began to do surveys around the country. And I did a couple of these early on in 84 and then 85. And we looked for places where food insecurity was high, or that I should say food security was low. There was no food, basically. And where people were showing up looking for food, selling things to try and get food. And so at each of these places where we identified, we would set up a relief camp, it was really like setting up a small city in this most remote area you can imagine, where there's no electricity, no water, no, sewage systems and that, and trying to take care of, literally thousands of people overnight. And Ajibar was one of them. It was up on a high plain in Tigray province, I believe, and it had just been devastated by the famine. And so we set up a feeding center there and started giving people both dry and wet rations and medical attention and everything like that. So that was one of 12 that over time we set up as part of our relief operation there.
So provide me some clarity, Steve. Did you and World Vision and other aid organizations kind of lift the veil on this famine crisis and invite the BBC in, or did the BBC, were they hearing about it from some of their connections as well? And they basically were sending folks in, and you guys just worked really from a logistical perspective to support them and to show them things? Because you're absolutely right. The BBC highlights it. It goes all around the world, and that was really the catalyst for Live Aid and all these other movements that really responded to it. So, how did that relationship look?
Yeah, we meaning World Vision was very instrumental, and I would say key to that process of sounding the alarm on the Ethiopia famine of 1984 and 1985. You remember that survey trip I told you about where I was asked to go? We actually, after we finished about a week, a little over a week in Ethiopia, I went to Nairobi, Kenya with the we had a guy named Jacob Akol, who was our communications manager on the ground in Africa at that time. And Jacob knew the Nairobi based BBC correspondent. And he invited him. His name was Michael. Shoot, now I can't remember his last name, but his name was Michael. And he invited Michael over to the World Vision office to see the video and the photos that we had just shot. So he came over, he came over to the office and we sat down and we showed him the video that I'd shot and some of the photos I had taken. I'd gotten quickly developed in Nairobi. And I remember distinctly Michael sitting back and going, I knew it. I
Hmm.
knew there was something going on, but I just didn't have the evidence of it because we weren't able to go. And he said that he was going to immediately get in touch with his office in London and see if they could send somebody down to cover this story because he actually had been kind of persona non grata with the Ethiopia government because of some political story he had done. So they weren't letting him in. So what he did was he contacted London and got a hold of another Michael Burke, who ended up being the guy who came in and broke the story of the Ethiopia famine wide open. And we were the ones that facilitated that visit. He came down in October. This was June, and then it took until October to get the permission to bring Michael Burke in and the cameraman by the name of Muhammad Amin from Nairobi to go in and actually film what was going on. So Michael Burke came in and again, we opened up our office to them. We took them on our plane. We took them around. They filmed. They came back. And within 48 hours, that story was on the BBC. And within 48 hours after that, it was on NBC in the US. And it just broke wide open. The whole world was aware of it.
You know, Michael Burke, he was there with you guys in late October of 84, and he described it as a biblical famine in the 20th century, which is
Mm-hmm.
pretty
Yeah.
powerful terminology.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Steve, what's going on with the Ethiopian government? You know, they're Marxists. They want to showcase their military might. They don't want to highlight any of their internal struggles. What caused them to basically say, like, okay, we're struggling here and we need some support, and allowing outside agencies to come and engage with? Because that sounds like an about face compared to how that government really wanted to operate. What happened? How did that happen?
Honestly, I don't know. I think what happened was they realized that they couldn't keep it a secret much longer. And they were petrified of it because it previously in the 70s, that's what brought down Emperor Haile Selassie in the early 70s was this famine. And he had tried to keep it a secret, but he couldn't keep it a secret. And that broke open and it caused really kind of a revolution that ended up bringing down the emperor. So I think what happened was that the regime in Addis Ababa, the Mengistu regime, decided that they weren't going to try and hide it. They were going to be open about it and they were going to ask for help. And that's what the emperor had done. He hadn't asked for any help. And so that just infuriated the local population. So I think what happened was that the Mengistu regime that had decided that they were going to go ahead and ask for help to overcome this famine. And that's how it broke open. Finally, they gave permission to come in and see everything.
Steve, I was in Addis maybe 10 years ago, and they took me on a tour of all the major sites in the capital. And I went by a house, I think they refer to it as the Pink House. Is that their version of the White House? The presidential palace? Pink House,
Yeah,
is that right? So I go by
I
the
believe
Pink
so.
House and I pull out my camera and I start taking photos of it. And my handler said, like, no, put it away.
Oh yeah.
You can't take any photos of the Pink House. And,
Oh
I
no.
have to be
It's not,
surprised
that's a
that,
no-no.
yeah, so it still is to some degree a bit of a controlled state like that.
Oh, for sure. And it was much worse back in the 80s. And you literally could be hauled into prison or worse if you stepped out of line. So,
So, Steve, you're there. You guys are breaking it open. From your perspective, what would you say really conveyed the depth of the crisis from what you saw? Help picture that for us. What were you seeing?
well, I mean, from the first day of that survey trip, we went to this little village called Farsuma, and we pulled up in our Jeeps, our Land Cruisers, got out, and immediately what I saw was something I'd never seen in my life. There were thousands of people out in this field, lined up, snaking their way down this hillside. And there was a little hut at the top of the hill where they were handing out grain. I believe it was sorghum at the time. The government was handing out this food and they were giving one like coffee can to each family. And that was it. That's all they had. And when that was gone, I'm not even sure everybody that was there got a coffee can full of sorghum that day, but that's what they were giving out. They had a few bags stacked up, in the shed, and these guys were just handing it out, one coffee cup, and they would bring their little bags or whatever they had to take it. And that was it. And they didn't know when the next distribution of food was going to be. And I started just walking through the rows of people that were waiting, and I would ask permission, to take a picture. And I'll never forget, I came to this one dad, this one father, and he he himself was extremely thin, skinny, and he showed me his son. He took the little garment, little gabby they called it, off of his son and showed me. And this kid was just skin and bones, and I mean no muscle whatsoever on this kid. And you could see every single rib, his elbows. It was just something I just couldn't believe. And not only that, Brad, but in addition to that, in that area of Ethiopia, there was a belief that if you touch a hot stick to the skin, it will chase away the evil spirits that were causing disease or sickness or anything like that. And this poor kid had hundreds of burn marks all over his body. So not only was he starving, he had also suffered this incredible pain of a misguided cultural practice. And I just couldn't believe it. I was just like, God, where have you sent me? why, why is this happening right now? So it was a real moment for me. And I remember at that moment sort of putting down my camera, sitting under a tree, and just the only thing I could think of to say at that moment was, God, are you here? Stupid, I know, but it's like, God, are you here? Are you seeing this? Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Or, you know, I couldn't think of what else to say because it was the most, if there was ever such a thing as a God-forsaken land or a God-forsaken people or a God-forsaken situations, to me, this was it. And I remember, Brad, at that moment distinctly hearing God say, yes, I am here. And I have called you here to be my hands, to be my feet, and to be my eyes. if you don't want to do this, Steve, you can go back to your life in California. You can do what you've been doing. But if you want to do this work, this is what it is. And sort of like, tell me now if this is really what you want to do, because this is it. And from that moment on, I just said, okay, Lord, I'm in. I'm in. Use me. You can use me. Use me. If you can use my skills, if you can use my background, if you can use my anything, just do it, and I'll do it. So yeah. So I
You
stood
know,
up
there's
and I got my camera back, uh, around my neck, went back, and I went back to work, and I did it for 40 years.
there's a saying that the truth will set you free and you'll be free indeed. And you are seeing some real truth there. The reality, though, is facing, accepting, and dealing with truth at the same time can be incredibly painful. So, what you're telling me is it was like, this is going to be a very painful process. You're going to experience things that are going to change you. You will never go back, but this is really what's happening. And you have the capacity to bring a voice to really voiceless people, just like this dad.
Yeah. And I didn't think I could. I was like, God, are you sure? Me? Y- You think I can do something here? And he did. And he said, yeah, you just follow me, and I will show you. Not only will I show you, I will equip you. Because the saying, and I believe it so much now, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called, right? And that was absolutely my case. I didn't feel worthy. I didn't feel talented enough. There were people much more talented than I was, but I was there, and I just did what I could. I looked through the lens, and I clicked my little shutter, and I did my best, and he took it. He took that, right? As he does, and turned it into something I could never have imagined.
Steve, why do you think that dad was so open to basically take that Gabby, move it aside, and show you the state of his son? Why do you think he was willing to do that, and what motivated him to do that?
Well, I think it was just pure desperation, Brad. I think he had that look of desperation on his face. I remember it. Like, I don't know who you are, but if you can help me, I want you to see this. Like he had come to the end of everything else he could do. And that was a powerful moment too, because he, as a father, I don't think I would have wanted anybody to see, that. But he had this look on his face like, you're my last hope. If you have to do something for me, because this is it. My son and I and my whole family are going to die if you don't do something. And he must have just felt like, well, this is why you're here. Take a look. Here it is. And yeah, very poignant, very moving situation. When you get to that point as a parent, I've never been even close to that point, but I could sense that was what was driving him, was that sense of desperation.
He had nothing left to lose. He was playing the only cards he had in his hand, and so he had to show you his son to give you the sobriety you needed. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, folks that don't know, this famine was immense. 8 million people were impacted by it, and they estimate that 1 million people died because of it. And so there's a lot of great work that was being done, and the work that Steve and others were doing stopped and stemmed a lot of that death. But still, this was brutal, and they're estimating over 1 million people died from this. What were you guys doing, Steve? What did the camp look like? You talked a little bit about some of the resources, but bring us back to that camp. What am I going to see if I'm strolling through that? I am almost like a refugee in my own country because my government isn't able to, or is not focusing on the needs that I've got. They're serving me. What am I going to see if I'm strolling through that place?
It was I was incredibly organized, and I have to hand it to the World Vision Relief team for it was almost like a military operation in its efficiency. Every morning before dawn, these mostly women would start cooking these big 55-gallon drums full of this high protein porridge, and they were cooking it on fires, so you could smell the fire starting to burn early before dawn. And it would be like high protein milk powder and porridge, this kind of porridge that was high in protein. And then we also had these high protein biscuits that we got again from USAID, and they would start cooking this. And it would take a few hours. So I would guess around maybe 7:30 or 8, they would open up the line for what they call wet feeding. So they would have a table, and you would bring your child to this table, and they would measure the circumference of their arm. And if you were under a certain weight for height, you would be enrolled in this wet feeding program. And you would get a bowl of high protein porridge 3 times a day. And if you were extremely malnourished, you were put into what they would call super intensive feeding. And so they built all these buildings like literally overnight. Well, not overnight, but within weeks, they had a whole compound built made out of just poles and sheet metal, corrugated tin roofs and siding. And then they would block off these buildings, and some of them would be for intensive feeding. Some would be super intensive feeding, where you had a staff member actually feeding one spoonful at a time to a child who couldn't even hardly swallow, because they were so, they were so malnourished. They could hardly even swallow. That's how malnourished they were. They were so weak. And that was the super intensive feeding. And then the next room, or next several rooms, was the intensive feeding, where the kids would get a bowl of this porridge and a spoon, and a glass of water. And they would go and they would sit down and they would have this bowl of porridge. And they would do that 3 times a day. And then in another section of the camp, they would have what they call the dry rations, because each kid came with a family, right? Mom and dad, and sometimes brothers and sisters who were probably malnourished, but maybe not quite as malnourished. So they didn't have to go into the intensive feeding, right? So they would get what we called dry rations, which were mostly grain and then some vegetables and maybe some butter, oil, or something to cook with, and a little bit of the grain, which was usually teff, which was a local sort of wheat that they made their injera, the bread out of. And so we would distribute those, and they would just take that on their backs, and they would take this back to, if they lived locally, to their homes, or if they were camped out, they would just take it to their little camp where they were camping and have that as a meal. So, and then there were clinic rooms. There was a couple of clinics that were looking at children that were injured or not injured, but just had sicknesses you know, and things like that. So it was, like I said, it was like a little village that we ran, and, it just ran like clockwork.
Steve, were you guys quite successful and able to see those kids, their weights increase?
Oh yeah.
Did you ever have to deal with like kids dying in the camp?
Well, that's an interesting question, Brad, because one of the most difficult jobs that I could ever imagine having was for the doctor of the camp, or in some cases it was the nurse, but usually there was one doctor per camp. And they had to go out in the morning and do the initial assessments. And if a kid, or if an adult even, was too far gone, like if there was no way that they could medically be revived, they had to refuse entry. They couldn't take them. So most of the people that came in were, if you will, hate to say it, but salvageable or medically could survive. But yeah, there were times when people didn't make it. I remember one time in Lalibela camp where I was taking pictures and interviewing people about their stories. Where did you come from? What's it like back there? How long did it take you to get here and so forth? And this one family, and there was an old man sitting there, and then I went off and did something else, came back to that same family, and the old man had collapsed and had died. And so I actually had to let the staff know, and they were the ones who came and, yep, he's gone. They wrapped him up in a blanket and took him off. And there was a cemetery nearby, and there was a lot of activity in that cemetery. I'll tell you that.
That's brutal. That's just heartbreaking. Steve, thinking about jobs that folks were doing, what did your job look like? I know that you said you went in there from like a media perspective. Were you there to continually do marketing and communications in that area, or did they have you also like grab a shovel and do some work here and there as well? What did that look like?
So my job was, as communications officer, we had a communications team on the ground in Ethiopia as the relief program ramped up. And our job as a team, yes, was twofold. One was to create photos and stories to send around to all. As you know, World Vision is a partnership of offices. And there at the time was, I think, 12 support offices around the world that were constantly in need of stories and photos of the work that they used in their magazines and their direct mail appeals just all the time. And so that was one of our jobs. The other job was to help relate to and facilitate the global media representatives that were there. And especially in the early days, but the whole year, there was a constant stream of media coming through. I remember Japanese TV, Korean TV, Irish television, the BBC, and Channel 4 in the UK, television stations in Baltimore. I mean, every media outlet you can imagine was sending someone to Ethiopia, to get the story. So part of our job was to make sure that our staff, our doctors and our nurses and our relief staff weren't overwhelmed with requests from the media, right? So we organized it and we set times when our staff would be available, and we set it up so that, you would have X amount of time with our doctor, and then they had to go back and do their job. So we try to organize that a little bit. And they were all so great. They all wanted to help because, this is the way we got the word out. And this is the way World Vision and other NGOs raised money, was to get these stories and to get the media and to get attention to what was going on so that they could do their fundraising work.
Yeah, there were a few times in World Vision's history and probably other NGOs where events like this really propelled them to a new level. And I would say that World Vision would describe the Ethiopian famine as a touchstone of when they really transformed again as an organization. I think back to the time during the Vietnam War and the conflict when they did that. I think it was called Operation Sea Sweep. That's another moment in time. Responding to the AIDS crisis, of course, back in Africa. That was another massive moment. But this was a specific time in history that really changed people's perception of the organization and of aid work. Is that right?
Yes, it did. You're right. There were certain key moments in particular World Vision's history, that just kind of catapulted it to another level of not only attention, but relevance and, stepping up in a way, stretching the organization to kind of handle this immense issue and learning from it, learning how to do that. You know, World Vision had been very instrumental during the Pol Pot situation in Cambodia, where huge refugee camps were formed just in Thailand, on the Thailand side of the border, and World Vision was involved. And so there was learning there about how to do it, how not to, what not to do in situations like that. And so they were constantly learning how to do a better and better job. And that's why we saw in Ethiopia was just really just an incredibly organized effort. All hands on deck at that point.
So, Steve, in July of 1985, Bob Geldof and others host Live Aid, and amongst the performers, I think probably one of the most famous performances ever is Freddie Mercury and
Yeah.
and Queen. Exactly. I mean, that's just an amazing, passionate performance that they did. But another performer, of course, was U2 and Bono. And here comes, you were talking about all of this media that are interested, and here comes this little guy from Ireland. At this point, he and his band had released quite a few albums, just to wrap people up with where they were at that point. So once Steve is connecting with Bono, they'd released their first debut album, Boy, great album, has I Will Follow on it. And then the year later, they released October, has hits like Gloria on it. And then that famous album, War, it's got Sunday Bloody Sunday on it. And then in 84, Pride in the Name of Love and Bad, two great songs, was off of The Unforgettable Fire. So this is a pretty well-known band by 85. And how did you first hear that Bono and his wife Ali wanted to visit the camp discreetly, not really be known that he was headed there, and really see this firsthand? This is, like I said, this is after Live Aid. He wants to experience it firsthand. He wants to be impacted and affected by it. How did you first hear that Bono wanted to be a part of something like this?
Well, first of all, I have to explain. I had never heard of U2 when this came about.
Steve, what kind of music were you listening to? What
I
were you listening to?
I don't know.
What was it?
What was I thinking? I was like,
Were you
that was
like listening to the Carpenters or
it was
something
the
like that at this
70s,
point?
man. Yeah, yeah. No, I was like, yeah. I had a brother who was a rock and roller, so I was probably listening to more, Jimi Hendrix and, a little more Led Zeppelin probably than I should have in the day.
Great music.
But
Bono would have been proud that you were listening to that. That's good music.
and I went through a Bob Dylan phase and back in the early days. But anyway, I had never heard of U2, and this was actually when we were approached. It was after Live Aid. It was more like August or
Right.
September of 85.
Couple months after.
Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest with you, Brad, I was a little cynical at that point because we had had many celebrities come through. I mean, most of them were like, I don't want to say B level, but just wanted to be seen in the context of the famine, and I spent a lot of time, helping to facilitate visits of people that I knew were just kind of go back to Hollywood and back to their lives. I was just, at that point you're exhausted because, every single day now at that point going on 8, 9, 10 months, I get up every day and you work hard and you're just exhausted. And I kind of just wasn't excited about this singer coming, but I said, okay, whatever. It's my job. Let's go ahead. Let's do it again. Let's get excited, whatever. So I got the information. We just got a telex. In those days, the telex machine was the primary way of communicating. Can you imagine? Literally one letter at a time. That was how we communicated with the world. And we got a telex one day.
But you thought that was pretty cool back then. You're like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
This is incredible.
Is communication. Wow, I type it here and they read it there. Wow, what a thought. Anyway.
What a world. What a world.
Cutting edge. But we got this telex saying this guy's coming, and we were to keep it a big we're keep it a big secret. We're no media attention, no whatsoever. It was to be kept on the down low. And his name was Paul Hewson and his wife Allison. And of course, my boss at the time, Pat Banks, but she knew who U2 was, and she knew who Bono was because she was British, and they were big in the UK at the time. Of course, they had created this sensation at Live Aid, but they were still kind of developing their own following in the US. I hadn't seen Live Aid because I was in Ethiopia when Live Aid happened, so I didn't see that performance, and I didn't know anything about U2. So I was like, okay, whatever. So we facilitated. We had to write them a letter of invitation. We had to, for their visas, we had to organize their travel permits within the country, through the government. It was all very tightly controlled, and et cetera, et cetera. So I did all of that and got all the permits and everything. And my colleague actually was the one who went to the airport to meet him. And I met Bono when they got back to the hotel. And yeah,
What was it like meeting him for the first time? Like, I mean, do you think it benefited you, Steve, that you didn't really know who this guy was? Not to be disrespectful, you didn't really care too much who he was. Was that like a feather in your cap in dealing with this mega celebrity?
I don't know. Maybe. All I know at this point is that I was completely underwhelmed. Bono's not a big guy. He's a short little guy. He had a mullet, which I was not crazy about. And he looked, when I first met him, he looked kind of scared. Like I saw him in the hallway of the Ethiopia hotel, and he kind of looked like he was looking around, like not sure of himself. And I was just like, "Hey, how you doing? I'm Steve. Let's go downstairs. Let's get some dinner. How you doing? Let's talk about your trip." But he was kind of unsure of himself, and I I think that added. He talks about that actually later in one of his books about how he felt nervous, when he first got there. I think that helped him get completely away from the rock star status that he was used to. And I think it helped him to just be humble and not expect anything from anybody and to just let others help him get adjusted and get into whatever he was going to do. And I think it did. I think it did help him because you need that when you go to a country. You need to have other people help you get your feet on the ground, get culturally sensitized, learn. And he did that. He was I guess you could say he was the perfect worker in the sense that he didn't come across like he knew everything. He didn't come across as the boss, or he didn't come across as entitled. He just was there to work. And his wife Ali was amazing too. She was so sweet and so humble and so willing to help out in any way she could. It was just they were really started off their time well, and I think that initial nervousness really helped with that.
Well, with that being said, Steve, I mean, I think it's safe to say that our wives are always better than us. So I am not surprised at all that Ali was the shining light and probably was someone that Paul Bono was really, really thankful that she was with him. Did he look like Bono when you saw him? Did he have the shades on and did he look cool? Or did he just
Oh
look like
no,
this little Irish guy?
no, he looked nothing like what he looks like now. Again, he had this like mullet. So the hair was long in the back, like on his shoulders. And then the front was like poofed up, like really tall. And I'm sure that was probably his stage look. He probably had just finished a tour, or something. But it didn't look anything like what he looks like now with the short hair, and the glass. He didn't have glasses on. I don't think he wore. I don't remember him wearing sunglasses ever in Ethiopia that I recall.
Well, that's ironic. So when he actually gets to a place where sunglasses are going to be super helpful, he doesn't have his signature shades on.
Yeah, I don't know. maybe the sun of Ethiopia damaged his retina or something. I don't know, but it seemed like he always did after that. But no, he didn't wear his thing. I remember he had a camera. He had just bought this new camera. I don't know if it was a Nikon or something, but he was always taking pictures with his camera. He's experimenting with it. And so after, well, after he spent time in the camps, we had a few days to tour around Ethiopia to all the various camps, the Oxfam camp and the Irish Concern camp and the Save the Children camp and all that. And I mean, he had this camera with him and he was just going nuts with this new camera, trying to figure out how to use it and capturing all that. I remember one time he climbed up a tree and was taking pictures of this cow that was going down. This kid was leading this cow down this path and he was up in a tree shooting down on the. I remember thinking, oh, great. This guy's gonna fall and break his neck, and
I mean,
I'm gonna be the guy who broke Bono, who killed Bono. And
he's a little Irishman. He's got to get up into a tree so he can get a good vantage point,
like
right?
Zacchaeus or something.
Exactly. In Steve's defense too, about like where was Bono and where was U2 in regards to like the zeitgeist of America, folks, this was before the Joshua Tree was released, and that album, just to remind everyone, had With or Without You on it. I still haven't found what I'm looking for, Where the Streets Have No Names, Bullet the Blue Sky, and Running to Stand Still. So tons of hits. And this was really their first Americana-inspired rock album, and it had just massive global success. So that was released in 87. So between the time of those albums I listed before and then being with you, Steve, in Ethiopia, the next album they release is Joshua Tree, and that was what really propelled them in the United States.
Yeah, and Where the Streets Have No Name was about Hajibar. He was very clear about that.
You're kidding.
No, that song was about Hajibar and about Ethiopia, because the streets in Hajibar had no name. There was no street. All you had to do is, there was a street that went north and a street that went south and a street that went east and a street that went west, and that was it.
That's powerful.
Yeah, that was about.
I had no idea.
Yeah, exactly.
So sounds like Bono was someone that was really respectful, wanted to really just kind of like let this experience soak into him so it could impact him. And we all know that it really did. What did he and his wife do? What did they take on? Were they doing logistics? Were they caring for people? Were they just kind of experiencing it from the side? Did they do things with music? What did it look like for them when they were at the camp?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, first of all, I think it's important to clarify this was Ali's idea to come to Ethiopia. And Bono told me this in no uncertain terms. It was she was the reason they came, because he would never say that he didn't want to come, but he was very clear that it was really Ali who kind of pushed them a little bit. Again, I can't speak for the actual.
She was a catalyst.
She was the catalyst to do it. Yeah, it was pretty much her idea. She actually, as I understand it, had some social work background, or she had a passion for social work and working with kids in underprivileged situations, mental, emotional help for kids. And so Ali actually wrote up some guidelines for children with emotional trauma based on some of the work that she did there in Ethiopia. And I don't know whatever happened to that. I don't know if it was ever published or whatever, but she did send some notes and reports afterwards. So I think that was something very significant for her. Bono, he was just there, and obviously his area was music. So he would work with our Ethiopian staff there to create songs about health and things like eating vegetables. I remember hearing the vegetable song where they created these big pictures of a big tomato or a big, cabbage, and they would sing this song. And whenever they would come to the word carrot, Bono would hold up the huge carrot, and then when they would come to the cabbage, he would hold up a big cabbage. And he also would play the guitar. Of course, he played the guitar. So he would put these songs to the guitar and help create, the rhythm and the verses and everything, so that, and then he would teach those to the staff so that they could carry it on when he left. So, and he also created this beautiful song called Ejibar, where they would be verses, and then the chorus was just Jibar, ah, Jibar. And all the children would sing that part. And then the staff would sing in Amharic in the verses. And then the children would all sing the chorus. And it was the most beautiful thing. And he made the whole thing up. He taught the whole thing. So it was awesome.
So this couple is really complementary of each other because Ali has all of this background in social work. She's super practical. Sounds like she's ahead of her time too, doing this stuff that is allowing people to really process through all the trauma that they were experiencing. Because, they were dealing with a lot of physical stuff, but that's going to have an impact on people spiritually, socially, mentally, right? Outside of the
Oh, yeah.
physical. And she was like, I got to deal with this. I've got to help people process through this. And then Bono really gave her space to do that. And then he thought to himself, well, what gifts do I have? And I don't know about you, but I mean, I can sing probably 30 U2 songs. And I know it word for word. And the reason for it is because for whatever reason, the human mind can remember melody, but we can't remember like printed word. It's very difficult for us. And so he was actually using catchy tunes and whatnot for these kids to learn these basic principles of, hey, this is what I need to do to stay and be healthy. And I think what I love about it too, Steve, is you didn't really know who he was. You weren't overly impressed with him. He probably just was relishing that after getting off stage in London. And these Ethiopians are even further aside from that. No clue who this guy is other than he's funny, he's charismatic, he plays the guitar really well, he seems to really care for us and connect with us. But they didn't know who he was and they didn't really care. They were just enjoying time with him. Is that right?
Oh, exactly. They had no clue who he was, and I had no clue who he was before he came, and it was just, yeah, it was a great equalizer. And you know, you're right. He had to kind of go back to the very basics and say, well, okay, how can I be useful here? What can I possibly blame? What can I possibly bring to this situation that would be of any value whatsoever? And okay, well, music. I know music. Let's let's see what we can come up with. And and it was brilliant. It was like, well, this. I mean, obviously everybody knows Bono he is a creative machine. He's constantly coming up with melodies and tunes and words and songs in his head. And this was no different. You know, he wasn't going to sit in a famine camp in Ethiopia for a month and not create. Yeah, that was just part of who he was. And so fortunately it had a very local impact. It wasn't a global smash hit, but it saved kids' lives. And it not only did it save kids' lives because they would, it reinforced healthy behaviors, but I want to say it changed some hearts too. It kind of helped get kids over a very physically, emotionally traumatizing period. And that in and of itself is a worthy outcome,
That's better than probably a lot of platinum records right there.
right? I think so too.
One thing I learned about Bono and U2 is that, one of his best buddies is The Edge, and they are just a really dynamic duo. And what I mean by that is I really believe U2 wouldn't be U2 without The Edge as well. I mean, all four of the band members are critical to their success and who they are, but The Edge is a pretty powerful singer-songwriter himself and brought a lot of that talent to the band. And of course, Bono's the personality and the front man, where The Edge is happy to kind of be in the background a bit more. So who knows what it would have been like if The Edge would have showed up. They maybe would have released another album if the two of them had gotten there. Steve, one thing that I can tell people is maybe about 15 years ago or so, I had the privilege of seeing U2, and they performed at the Key Arena in Seattle. And that's now called Climate Pledge, but it was Key Arena back then. And I was, in the sea of thousands of Seattleites that were enjoying the show, and it was great. They were, of course, they still are, but they were massive 15 years ago. And I kid you not, I'm listening in, and he's pausing and he's doing a little talk, and he mentions his friend from Seattle, you. He mentions you. And I was shocked when that happened. I wasn't expecting that. And I was like, I know Steve. And he mentions you, and he refers to you as his friend. And he talks a lot about what we're talking about today. Does it, of course, in maybe 30 seconds or so, but really shares around how you helped open his eyes up to the realities of the world, but he called you his friend. And so I just love to hear from you, like, how did you guys become friends there? How did you become friendly? How did you really connect with him? What did that look like?
Well, first of all, I want to say that Bono has a talent for overstatement, and especially when he's on stage. I think the word friend is probably taking it. I don't have his cell phone number. I don't call him, on Sundays or anything like that.
But if I said to Bono, "Hey, I met with Steve Reynolds the other day," it would take him about a half a second to click who that is, and he could go back to his time with you in Ethiopia. That's
Oh,
that's
yes,
certain.
that is true. That's true. He said some very kind things to me that night and on several occasions whenever he was in town. And when when we put Bono on the plane in Ethiopia back to Ireland, he just said, hey, if we're ever playing in a city where you're at, contact so and so, and we'll make sure you get passes and all of that. And I said, yeah, thanks. It was one of those kind of throwaway things you say to be nice to somebody. And I said, yeah, yeah, thanks, Bono. And so off he went. And I was never in a city where U2 was playing for many years because I was overseas. I was doing my thing. I was never in a place where U2 was playing, although I kept hearing them, I know, on the radio, and I kept hearing them, especially when Joshua Tree came out. It was like
Big album.
you couldn't hear anything else practically. Even in Nairobi, where I was living, it was big, and everybody, you could hear it even on the Kenya radio. You could hear U2. And somebody got the album in Nairobi, and we listened to it, and it was great. But I never was in a place where U2 was playing, not for years. And from Kenya, from Ethiopia, I went to the Sudan, and from the Sudan, I was in Nairobi for 3 years, and then went to Asia. So it just never was. There was never an opportunity for me to do that. And years later, I'm going to get the years right. I think it was 2002. I got a call from somebody at World Vision saying that Bono was going to do a tour of the United States. It was going to be a speaking tour, not a U2 tour. And would I be interested? Because they knew had met him. They said, "Would you be interested in going on this tour?" They want somebody from World Vision to have a table outside the venue or wherever they went to talk about World Vision. And they said, "Would you like to do that?" And I said, "Oh, sure, that'd be great." So I got some stuff together and I went out, and I will never forget, it was in Louisville, Kentucky, and he was going to be speaking at this huge church in Louisville. And I was outside of the venue at my little table, and all of a sudden the guy comes up to me and he's like, "Hey, how you doing? And are you here? I hear it looked like you're with World Vision. That's a great organization." I said, "Yeah, I'm here with World Vision. It's an honor to be here. Who are you?" And he said his name was Jamie Drummond. He was the head of Data, which was an organization that Bono had put together at the time, and he was based in London. And introduced himself, and he said, "And who are you?" And I said, "My name is Steve Reynolds." And I said, "Oh, by the way, I knew Bono back in the day. I was with him in Ethiopia, and it's fun to be here with you guys on this tour." And he looked at me and he said, "You were with Bono in Ethiopia?" And I said, "Yeah, I was with him." He said, "What's your name again?" I said, "Steve Reynolds." And he said, "Wait here, wait here, wait here." So he took off, went running back somewhere. A few minutes later, he comes back and he says, "Just to confirm, your name is Steve Reynolds." And I was like, at this point, I was like, "What's going on?" I said, "Yeah, my name is Steve Reynolds." And he said, "Bono would love to see you. He'd love to have you come backstage after the show tonight and talk to him." And so I did. I went back and I was back there, and with, oh my gosh, Winona Ryder was back there, and I don't know who all else was back there. I think Lance, the bicycle guy, was back there, and
Lance
anyway,
Armstrong.
Lance Armstrong was there, and we were all hanging out with Bono. And
He wasn't juicing backstage, was he?
no, he wasn't juicing. He was
Good.
he
Good.
was doing just fine, and he saw
Good.
me, and we had this big bear hug. And anyway, all that, but it was just like a reunion. Almost 20 years later, I hadn't seen him, hadn't heard from him, hadn't talked to him, and it was like no time had gone by whatsoever.
Well, that's how friends are, Steve.
Amazing. It's amazing.
That's how friends are.
It was
And
very generous of him, I thought.
I'm sure probably the things he was talking about during that session reflected a lot of the time that you spent with him too. So it was probably special for him to say, that's my
I think so,
connection from
because
the past.
I think it brought back a lot of memories. This trip, this tour, this presentation he was doing. There was an African children's choir. There was a woman, I think a nurse from Uganda named Agnes, who was giving a very powerful testimony about AIDS in Africa. I think it just brought a lot of memories back. And when he saw me, it just kind of clicked somehow. And I was very grateful for the opportunity. And I thought it was very generous of him to kind of make a fuss like that. Didn't he?
So if you can believe this, we're in the 20s now. This was back in the aughts, but we're going to go back 40 years. We're going back to the 80s again. And Steve, question for you about Bono and his time with Ali and you guys in Ethiopia. What would you say from your perspective is a way that you saw Bono's attitude shift from that initial discomfort that you described in the hotel to really deep engagement and being like comfortable in the moment? Did it relate to when he was able to do his music, when he was able to see his wife shining in her talents? When did that shift for him?
Whatever transformation occurred in Bono, it happened obviously during that month. And what I saw was a completely different person. He was engaged. He was asking probing questions about why is this famine, why is this famine happening? What's going on? What's precipitating it? He was making observations about what were the kinds of activities that we were doing. Was that the most effective? How could, how could he help? He wasn't asking how could he help bring attention to it, but he was asking more like, how could I help make this intervention more effective? What are the ways that we could make this more effective than it already is? And so I just felt like he was a much more informed, much more engaged, much more sure of himself in terms of asking questions that were informed questions rather than, just kind of trying to make conversation, but really seeking answers to probing questions. And yeah, I was impressed. And he had a tremendous amount of compassion. And I knew, I mean, it's not that he didn't have that compassion before, but he was able to, seems like he was able to express it more freely when we picked him up.
Do you know if there was like any moment while he was at the relief camp that he had, a specific interaction with someone, maybe a hug, a shared meal, a conversation that really symbolized what you're describing?
Well, no, I don't know. He didn't say anything to me about it. I know that he published a book of his photos. That camera I was talking about. He
For
actually
sure.
he published a book of his photos called String of Pearls, which is it's all just his photos from Ethiopia. I have a copy of it, a signed copy, which is pretty cool. It's one of my favorite possessions. But in there, he has a photograph, a picture of a little girl, and I forget the caption of it, but he says, "This girl," something like, "This girl opened my eyes, and I will never forget her." Or something, I forget the exact words, but you know what I mean? It was like this, sounds like this one little girl seemed to have a real profound effect on him. Just kind of bringing it all together in one face.
Mm.
Um, and I remember that from his book. Mm. But yeah, I mean, obviously it had a profound effect on him because it was at that point, Brad, that Bono kind of, took on the world, you know, and he used what I love about Bono is he used his platform and his fame to to bring awareness to other causes, not in a not in an annoying way, but in an inspirational and uplifting way. A lot of celebrities have a lot of causes, and he used to say this, I'm just another celebrity with a cause. But the way Bono did it, in my opinion, was different because he wove it so seamlessly into his music and his shows that it was, I mean, honestly, it was almost like going to church to go to a U2 concert and hear about Africa. It was almost like this spiritual thing. And yeah, I'm convinced that we had a pretty good part to play in that.
What would you say, Steve, in the decades since that's been 40 years, how would you say that their early Ethiopian experience have really echoed through the different campaigns? You mentioned data. Remember one back in the day, Live 8, of course, that happened. I don't know, maybe that was 10, 15 years ago or so. How have you seen that experience really echo in how he's advocated in the future?
I think Bono, he has to feel it first, like with debt cancellation. There was this moment in year 2000, or was it maybe 2001, which was marked as the year of Jubilee in the Bible. And there was a big celebration of the year of Jubilee. And and there was a movement, a small movement, but a movement to use that moment to call for debt cancellation. These countries like Ethiopia and other many countries who were struggling under so much debt because the rich countries had lent them all this money with the expectation that they would become successful democracies and capitalist countries and that they would pay it back. And of course what ended up happening was they were just you know saddled with enormous debt that they could never pay back. And they were spending more money on servicing their debt than, their entire GDP. So they couldn't really do much to tackle poverty. So anyway, there was this this Jubilee movement, and Bono thought that was the coolest thing. I remember him talking about it at the time, and like, what an idea, just set everything back and start again. Well, isn't that what Jesus does for us? Isn't that the idea of redemption? Isn't that the idea of debt being canceled and being taken away? So I love. So he was loving that, and that was when he was. From there it was. Well, there's this HIV/AIDS crisis going on, and people are dying in their millions, in the millions, for lack of a little pill that they could get in the United States easily enough, but in Africa and other places, you couldn't get it. And so, where's the justice in that, right? There's like this incredible imbalance. So he got excited about that, and he started talking about it. And that was when I met him, of course, when he was on this HIV/AIDS tour. And I just think that Bono has not only does he have a great sense of creativity, he also has a great sensitivity. I think creative people maybe are very sensitive, and so he sees things like injustice, and he just can't stand it. And the cool thing about Bono is he doesn't just sit around and say, "Well, it's too bad," or he doesn't criticize other people. He gets busy and starts doing things, and that honestly, Brad, has led to so many issues, and I can't name them all, but whenever he gets excited about something, he sees the potential there, he's all in, and he'll take it and run with it. Much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of the band, these other guys like this. Not again, Bono. What are you doing? And his fans, he told me one time, Steve, how many times have I had to listen to "Shut up and sing"? True, true. He puts up with it. So.
The beauty is he uses that talent, he uses that music to be able to bring a voice to those other things that people maybe don't want to hear or not interested in hearing, because no one would pay $50 for a ticket to hear about the plight of the poor in some distant land. But if he can sprinkle that in amongst these hits they're hearing on the radio, they'll be there and they'll be excited and inspired by that. So I think he's no idiot to do something like that.
Nope.
Whatever happened with the year of Jubilee? Did that get sorted? Did we cancel all that debt? Because it doesn't seem almost criminal to say, like, I'm going to charge interest on this country that can hardly sustain itself on these past debts that they have. I mean, if anyone needs to not have to deal with that, it would be a country that is really emerging or maybe developing.
I think it did. I think a lot of debt was canceled by the G7 countries, and a lot of debt was reduced. Billions. I don't know if it was all reduced or taken away completely. But yeah, no, in the early 2000s, it was a big deal, and there was a lot of support for it. Of course, you've got a lot of interest there, and a lot of banks, and it's not just as cut and dry as you would want it to be. But my understanding is that, yeah, a lot of debt was canceled, a lot of debt was rescheduled in a way that was more compassionate, I guess you could say.
It's great, Steve. Thanks. So, Steve, thinking about folks that are listening into this podcast and they're inspired by Bono and Ali saying, "Yeah, I'll go. I'll head over there. I'll experience. I'll walk alongside and see what these folks are experiencing and open my heart, my mind to the realities of what folks are going through." What practical steps would you say that you could recommend that people could get involved in something like that around global relief work? What could they do?
Well, it's a different game than it was 40 years ago, when honestly the joke was, if you got caught loitering around the water fountain, you got sent to Ethiopia. It's practically my case. But these days, they they want a lot more specialists. And I would say, for anyone who wants to get involved with international development or relief work, find an opportunity to volunteer overseas. In fact, my wife and I are going to volunteer because I'm retired now. We're going to go volunteer in Zambia for a small mission over there that does medical work and hosts medical teams and so forth. I have another friend who is volunteering with Mercy Ships right now. They take volunteers. Very happy to have even people without medical training. You could still volunteer to work in the kitchens or do the cleaning and stuff like that. Get yourself over there and put yourself in a situation where you can serve. It doesn't necessarily have to be a specialist role, but just get yourself immersed in something like that and get your mind into another culture for a period of time. If you really want a career in this kind of work, it probably would require more professional training, whether it be medical training, child protection, child trauma, and child counseling is a big area, especially for organizations like World Vision, which deal a lot with children. Like that's the focus of their programmatic approach really is children. So, child child protection, anti-trafficking work also has a lot to do with legal rights. So studying the law, studying where countries have gaps in their laws that would allow, this kind of thing to take place is also very helpful. So think of something that would be useful in a long-term situation and put yourself in a position to apply for a job like that. And you go online and organizations like World Vision, Save the Children, CARE, Samaritan's Purse is a great organization. They do a lot of relief work and medical work. Find out what kinds of jobs are being sought right now overseas. Find out what it takes to prepare for something like that. And then, like I said, just find a volunteer opportunity, a short-term mission even is okay. I mean, I've come a long way on my understanding of short-term missions. I used to be really against it. Now I think, hey, if it's an opportunity to get overseas and immerse yourself in another culture, talk to people in another country, talk to people with a different view of the world than yours, I say, take it, do it. It's all good. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. But those are the things I would suggest people who are listening, who want to do this kind of work should do to prepare themselves.
That's great, Steve. Appreciate that. So, how about you, Steve? Where can people go to follow your ongoing work or reach out to you on any collaborative efforts around storytelling projects? How do they reach out to you? How do they find you?
I am on Facebook. Just look up, the best way to do it would be to look up Steve Reynolds World Vision. That's usually a good way that usually connects to it. I'm on Instagram at Steve Reynolds. And I also, I love to hear from anybody who wants to contact me. And I got a lot more time now that I'm retired. So happy to chat.
Thank you, Steve. And then just finally, is there anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap things up?
No, thanks for what you're doing, Brad. And congratulations on your new podcast.
Really appreciate you, Steve. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Brad. Take care.
That's a wrap on the Wide Lens podcast. If today's episode broadened your view of history, please follow, rate, and review us. It makes a real difference. A heartfelt thanks to our guests for their story and to Sergei Shadrin for providing the music. Know someone who's witnessed a pivotal moment? Drop us a line at ideas@widelenspodcast.com. Their story could be next. Until next time, keep looking at history through the wide lens.